Imagine it, a dark country road in the deep south, lit only by the pale glow of the moon. A horse's hooves thud against the dirt path. In the distance, a faint flicker begins to glow brighter, fire licking the night sky. The smell of smoke drifts heavy, and then comes the sound. Chanting, strange and hollow, as if carried by the wind from another world. The Ku Klux Klan has cast a long and painful shadow across American history. What happened next? Hello, followers. Welcome back to another episode of the Shadows of History series. If you're into gripping documentaries, deep dives into historical events, hidden truths, and untold stories, you're definitely in the right place. Before we jump in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts. Big shout out to all our new subscribers, welcome to the family. And to my returning viewers, you already know, you're the real hero. Alright, let's dive into today's story. You're not going to want to miss this one. For more than 150 years, this organization has used fear. Out of the shadows they emerge. Dozens, perhaps hundreds. White-robed figures with pointed hoods concealing their faces. They ride together like a phantom army, carrying torches, crosses, and whips. Their purpose is clear: to terrify, to control, to silence. The Ku Klux Klan, the so-called Invisible Empire, is on the march. For more than 150 years, this secretive brotherhood of hate has haunted America's history. Born in the ashes of the Civil War, resurrected in the roaring 1920s, and revived again in times of racial conflict, the Klan has been both a shadowy terrorist group and, shockingly, a mainstream social movement. They burned crosses, bombed churches, and lynched men, women, and children, all in the name of defending white supremacy. But their story is not one of simple dominance. It is a story of rise and fall, of infiltration and betrayal, of fractured identities and failed empires. For every chapter of terror the Klan has written in America's past, there has also been resistance, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice. This is not just the story of a hate group, it is the story of how hate itself adapts, survives, and mutates over generations. To understand the Ku Klux Klan is to confront one of the darkest, most controversial legacies in American history. And yet, despite the violence, despite the fear they inspired, their ultimate power was always an illusion. Behind the robes and masks, behind the burning crosses and bloody spectacles, were men, ordinary men, terrified of change, clinging to privilege and willing to kill to preserve it. As we peel back 150 years of the Klan's existence, we'll explore its origins in the chaos of Reconstruction, its meteoric rise into a national powerhouse, its brutal role during the Civil Rights Movement, and its fading yet lingering influence today. Along the way, we'll uncover shocking truths: politicians who courted the Klan, ministers who blessed it, businessmen who bankrolled it, and citizens who quietly condoned it. But we'll also hear the voices of those who fought back, the freedmen who refused to cower, the activists who marched in defiance, and the journalists who risked their lives to expose the Klan's crimes. This is a story filled with violence and terror, but also with courage and resilience. A story that forces us to ask, how does hate survive for so long? And what does its persistence reveal about America itself? It is deeply woven into the nation's struggles with race power identity. This essay will journey through the dark chapters of the Klan's history. It will examine its origins, its various waves of influence, its persistent, destructive impact on countless lives. Understanding this history is not an academic exercise, it is a vital responsibility. The echoes of the Klan's campaign of hate can still be heard today, a solemn reminder of the vigilance required to protect freedom and equality for all. The Klan is America's oldest and most infamous hate group. Tonight we begin our journey into the dark heart of the Ku Klux Klan. The Civil War had ended, the guns fell silent, the armies disbanded, and the land lay in smoldering ruin. The Confederacy had been defeated, its cities destroyed, and its people left to grapple with a future they neither wanted nor understood. But for many white Southerners, the end of the war was not a relief. It was a catastrophe. Their world, built on slavery and the social hierarchies of the antebellum South, had been upended. Amid the ruins of plantations and the cries of newly freed men and women, a new kind of terror quietly began to emerge. It was not an army in uniform, nor a political movement in broad daylight. It was a secret, a whisper in the night. In Pulaski, Tennessee, a small group of former Confederate soldiers, frustrated and humiliated by defeat, formed what they called the Ku Klux Klan in 1865. The name itself, shrouded in mystery, came from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle, a circle bound by secrecy and purpose. Their stated goal was deceptively patriotic, to protect Southern society and preserve order. But the Klan's definition of order was brutal and exclusive. To them, the emancipation of black Americans was a threat. Any challenge to white supremacy was a personal affront. They claimed to be a fraternal organization, a brotherhood, yet their rituals, costumes, and symbols were designed to instill fear. White robes and pointed hoods concealed their identities, while secret codes and signals created an aura of omnipresence. By 1866, the Klan had spread beyond Tennessee. Night riders terrorized towns across the South, burning homes, whipping black families, and murdering those who dared exercise their newfound rights. Political leaders and freedmen were their targets. Schools for black children were burned. Churches were desecrated. The Klan was not just a mob, it was a calculated weapon of intimidation. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Klan's early existence was its invisibility. No one knew who was behind the robes. A neighbor could be a Klansman, a shopkeeper, even a member of local government. Ordinary citizens lived under a cloud of fear, uncertain whether they would be the next victim of violence. The Klan thrived not only because of the acts themselves, but because of the terror they inspired, an invisible enemy lurking in plain sight. The federal government eventually responded. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed the Enforcement Acts, including the Ku Klux Klan Act, granting the president power to suspend habeas corpus and deploy federal forces against Klan violence. President Ulysses S. Grant took action, sending troops into the South and prosecuting hundreds of Klansmen. For a moment, the invisible empire seemed to falter. Secret oaths, burning crosses, and night rides were curtailed. Yet even in defeat, the Klan's mythology had taken hold. Their story became a tale whispered in the South, a mix of terror, romance, and lost honor. They were no longer just a band of ex-Confederates. They were an idea, a symbol of resistance against Reconstruction, and a frightening emblem of white supremacy. In this early period, the Klan demonstrated a strategy that would define its existence for the next century, combining secrecy, spectacle, and violence to assert power. They understood the psychological dimension of terror. It was not enough to punish an individual. The act had to send a message to an entire community. Cross burnings, night raids, and public floggings were as much about psychology as punishment. Fear became their most potent weapon. This first wave of the Ku Klux Klan would ultimately decline by the late 1870s, as federal enforcement and internal discord fractured the organization. But the foundation had been laid. The idea of the Klan, an invisible, omnipresent guardian of racial hierarchy, was embedded in Southern culture. Their symbols, rituals, and myths would be resurrected in the decades to come, evolving into something even more terrifying. A mass movement capable of influencing politics, society, and culture. As Reconstruction policies began to grant African Americans political power, the Reconstruction-era Klan was more than a terror group. It was the first glimpse of organized, systemic racial violence that would haunt America for generations. And while their robes might have disappeared from the streets for a time, the ideology they championed never truly vanished. The right to vote. As the 20th century dawned, the stage was set for the Klan's rebirth. A new America, modern, industrial, and urban, would become the backdrop for the second Ku Klux Klan, one that was not just regional, but national, sophisticated, and shockingly mainstream. But that is a story for the next chapter, a story of mass rallies, political influence, and an empire built on both fear and spectacle. The Klan's ideological legacy also manifests in subtler forms. Cultural, political, and social currents that echo the Klan's principles, racial resentment, anti-immigrant sentiment, and organized intimidation, periodically resurface in mainstream discourse. Historians often note that while the visible Klan may have declined, the ideas that allowed it to thrive are remarkably persistent. The threat is no longer always uniform or centralized, but decentralized, dispersed, and adaptable. One stark example of the Klan's lingering influence is the intersection with contemporary hate groups. During the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Klan splinter groups occasionally joined forces with neo-Nazi organizations, skinhead gangs, and extremist militias, forming temporary alliances around common racial ideologies. These collaborations illustrate the enduring potency of Klan ideology. Even when organizational structures fail, the ideas themselves are resilient, capable of inspiring violence across decades. Moreover, public fascination with the Klan continues. Documentaries, history books, films, and media coverage keep the image of the Klan alive in collective consciousness. This fascination is double-edged. It educates new generations about the horrors of racial terror, but it can also romanticize or mythologize the Klan, unintentionally reinforcing the mystique that historically amplified their psychological power. Today, the Klan exists primarily as a fragmented, symbolic force. National membership numbers are tiny compared to historical peaks, but their ideology survives in online forums, extremist networks, and subcultural communities. Their legacy is a reminder of the long shadow of hate, a shadow that adapts, hides, and reemerges in times of social anxiety, economic uncertainty, or racial tension. The modern echoes of the Klan teach an uncomfortable truth. Eradicating organizations of hate is not enough. The ideology that fuels them must be confronted continually through education, cultural awareness, and vigilance. While the old invisible empire no longer marches through the streets in force, its lessons endure, challenging society to recognize and resist the persistence of racial terror in all its forms. Became the self-proclaimed invisible empire of the South, a ghostly army waging a campaign of terror against black citizens and their white allies. The primary goal of this first Klan was the complete political and social subjugation of the newly freed African American population. The 1920s in America are often remembered as a time of jazz, speakeasies, and the intoxicating allure of modernity. Yet beneath the glittering surface of flappers and automobiles lurked a darker, more insidious revival. The Ku Klux Klan, nearly extinct after the Reconstruction era, re-emerged from the shadows, not as a secretive band of disgruntled ex-Confederates, but as a sprawling national organization. As the Klan's campaign of terror and murder escalated across the South, the federal government under President Ulysses S. Grant could no longer stand by. This was the era of the Second Klan, born in Georgia in 1915, inspired in part by the sensationalized film The Birth of a Nation, which romanticized the First Klan and painted them as heroic defenders of the South. The movie did more than entertain. It served as a recruitment tool, igniting imaginations and stirring fears among white Americans who believed their traditional way of life was under threat. The Klan's new mission expanded beyond anti-black racism. Now, they targeted immigrants, Catholics, Jews, labor organizers, and anyone they considered un-American. By the mid-1920s, membership skyrocketed. Estimates suggest that 3 to 6 million Americans had joined, with Klan chapters in nearly every state, from the Deep South to the industrial North and even the West. The organization transformed from a secretive terrorist group into a public, highly visible force. Klansmen marched in parades, held mass rallies, and plastered towns with Klan propaganda. Their robes and hoods remained iconic, but now they were symbols of pride and community for many, rather than instruments of clandestine terror. The violence was a direct assault on the constitutional amendments passed after the Civil War. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th granted citizenship, the 15th secured voting rights for black men. The modern echoes of the Klan teach an uncomfortable truth. Eradicating organizations of hate is not enough. The ideology that fuels them must be confronted continually through education, cultural awareness, and vigilance. While the old invisible empire no longer marches through the streets in force, its lessons endure, challenging society to recognize and resist the persistence of racial terror in all its forms. It passed a series of laws known as the Enforcement Acts. These laws made it a federal crime to conspire to interfere with citizens' civil and political rights. Politically, the Second Klan wielded enormous influence. They lobbied for restrictive immigration laws, won local and state elections, and pressured political leaders to endorse their agenda. Governors, senators, and even presidential candidates courted the Klan's favor, recognizing the power of their vast membership. This was a Klan that had moved beyond the backwoods night rides. It was now part of mainstream America's social and political fabric. The most powerful of these was the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Yet beneath the pageantry and public rallies, violence remained a core tool. The Klan still burned crosses in the night, intimidated voters, and attacked those who defied their moral and social codes. Their terror was now more structured and widespread. Local police forces and politicians were sometimes complicit, either turning a blind eye or actively assisting Klan operations. This period demonstrated the frightening adaptability of the Klan. They could thrive both in secrecy and in plain sight. Culturally, the Klan tapped into a pervasive anxiety about a rapidly changing nation. Urbanization, industrialization, and immigration were shifting demographics and unsettling established hierarchies. The Klan offered a sense of identity and belonging for white Protestants who felt displaced or threatened. They wrapped their ideology in rhetoric about American values and moral purity, presenting themselves as guardians of family, church, and nation. The spectacle of the Klan, marches, ceremonies, and elaborate regalia, was as much about propaganda and recruitment as it was about fear. This landmark legislation gave the president the authority to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, declare martial law, and use federal troops to suppress Klan violence. Despite its reach, cracks were already appearing in the Second Klan. Scandals involving corruption, sexual misconduct, and criminal activity among Klan leaders eroded public trust. Internal rivalries fractured local chapters, and public exposure by journalists and reformers began to undermine their legitimacy. By the late 1920s, membership dwindled as the allure of mass rallies could no longer conceal the rot within. Yet the legacy of the Second Klan endured far beyond its peak. It normalized the notion that racist, xenophobic, and anti-Catholic sentiment could be organized into a powerful political movement. The Klan demonstrated chillingly that hate could be both a spectacle and a strategy, blending ideology, performance, and coercion. For the millions who witnessed its rise, one noble sirs. Klan became a fixture in the social consciousness, a reminder that terror could wear a mask of respectability. In October 1871, he declared 9 counties in South Carolina to be in a state of rebellion. Hundreds of Klansmen were arrested, and for the first time, the federal government began to systematically prosecute members of the Invisible Empire. As the 1930s and 1940s approached, the Klan receded from national prominence, yet its ideology persisted underground. Its methods, intimidation, recruitment, and infiltration, remained instructive for future hate groups. And when the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s emerged, the Klan would resurface once again, more violent and desperate, intent on resisting the social progress it had fought to prevent for nearly a century. By 1872, The first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan was largely broken as an organized, effective force. The Klan's power was not just in its robes or rituals, but in its ability to adapt, to seize moments of societal fear, and to transform private prejudice into public force. They were a mirror reflecting America's deepest anxieties: race, religion, and identity, and a warning that hate could thrive wherever it found fertile ground. The power of the Ku Klux Klan has never rested solely on numbers or politics. It has always relied on spectacle. From its earliest days, the Klan understood that fear is magnified when it is public, performative, and unrelenting. A single act of terror could ripple through an entire community, shaping behavior and silencing opposition long after the flames died down. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a dramatic rebirth in the early 20th century, emerging as a powerful and mainstream national movement. Lynching, the most infamous instrument of Klan terror, was both punishment and performance. Often conducted in broad daylight, sometimes attended by hundreds of onlookers, lynchings were grotesque rituals, designed to enforce social hierarchy through intimidation. The victims were almost always African Americans, but Catholics, Jews, labor organizers, and other outsiders were also targeted. Photographs of lynching, sometimes turned into postcards, circulated widely, sending a stark message: defiance would be met with death. The spectacle was carefully orchestrated. Crosses were burned to light the night and symbolize white supremacy. Victims were publicly humiliated before violence was enacted. Even when bodies were left to rot as warnings, the act reinforced the Klan's omnipresent authority. These rituals were not random acts of cruelty. They were strategic exercises in mass intimidation. Communities were terrorized, obedience was extracted, and fear became a tool of social control. This second wave was officially launched in 1915 by William J. Simmons. The revival was heavily inspired by the romanticized portrayal of the first Klan in D.W. Griffith's blockbuster film, The Birth of a Nation. Yet terror alone was not enough. The Klan complemented violence with propaganda, controlling the narrative to attract allies and normalize their ideology. Klan newspapers, pamphlets, and later films spread messages of moral righteousness, patriotism, and racial purity. They portrayed themselves as defenders of civilization, pious Christians protecting their communities from the perceived threats of African Americans, immigrants, Jews, and Catholics. In this way, they framed themselves not as criminals, but as moral arbiters, justifying their terror in the language of righteousness. Media played a dual role. In some communities, local newspapers were complicit, printing Klan-friendly coverage or turning a blind eye to atrocities. In other cases, journalists risked their lives to expose the Klan, documenting violence and corruption, and revealing the organization's true brutality to the wider public. Activists, particularly African American journalists and writers, fought to counter Klan propaganda with their own narratives of resistance and truth. Their reporting helped shape public perception and laid the groundwork for federal intervention during Reconstruction and beyond. This new Klan was not just a Southern phenomenon. It established a strong presence in the Midwest, the West, and the Northeast, attracting millions of members from all walks of life. Propaganda and spectacle combined to create an aura of invincibility. Even those who had never witnessed a Klan raid believed in their omnipotence. Ordinary citizens lived in fear of unknown enemies lurking behind familiar faces. The robes, hoods, and secret rituals of the Klan became symbols of terror and mystery, reinforcing the psychological impact of their actions. This second Klan broadened its list of enemies. The Klan's mastery of media and symbolism is often overlooked, yet it is central to understanding their enduring influence. They understood the power of imagery: a burning cross, a hooded figure on horseback, a rally attended by thousands. These were not just acts or events, they were propaganda in motion. They manipulated perception to amplify their presence, making themselves seem everywhere, even when they were not. While still fiercely anti-black, it also targeted Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and anyone else it deemed un-American. The consequences of this media-savvy terror were profound. Communities were cowed, dissenters silenced, and laws were bent to accommodate the Klan's influence. Political leaders courted their favor, fearing electoral backlash if they opposed the organization. Social institutions, from churches to schools, were pressured to conform to their ideology, either overtly or subtly. Hate became a tool of both public and private power, enforced through a combination of fear, spectacle, and narrative control. The Klan's message of 100% Americanism. Unlike its predecessor, the Second Klan operated largely in the open. The consequences of this media-savvy terror were profound. Communities were cowed, dissenters silenced, and laws were bent to accommodate the Klan's influence. Political leaders courted their favor, fearing electoral backlash if they opposed the organization. Social institutions, from churches to schools, were pressured to conform to their ideology, either overtly or subtly. Hate became a tool of both public and private power, enforced through a combination of fear, spectacle, and narrative control. In August 1925, an estimated 40,000 Klansmen marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. But the Klan's terror was never absolute. Resistance existed in every era. African American communities developed networks of self-defense, mutual aid, and underground education to counter Klan intimidation. Reformers, journalists, and activists exposed Klan atrocities, challenging their propaganda with facts, photographs, and testimony. These acts of courage, though often costly, demonstrated that fear could be contested, and that the Klan's power was, at its core, fragile, dependent on the silence and complicity of the larger society. The most iconic of these is the white robe and pointed hood. By the time the civil rights movement emerged in the 1950s and 1960s, the Klan had learned to adapt again. Terror would return to the night, but now with a more violent, desperate edge. Yet even as their methods evolved, the central lessons remained the same. Violence plus spectacle plus media manipulation equals power. And in understanding this formula, historians, journalists, and citizens alike gained crucial insight into the enduring corrosive influence of the Ku Klux Klan on American society. First, it made the Klansmen anonymous. Second, the ghostly white costumes were intended to be intimidating. The burning cross is perhaps the most potent and feared symbol associated with the Klan. It was dramatically introduced by the Second Klan in the 1910s. A burning cross, often lit at night on a hilltop or in front of a victim's home, served as a warning, a threat of impending violence, and a declaration of the Klan's presence and power. It was a form of psychological terrorism, a fiery symbol of hate that could terrorize an entire community without a single shot being fired. The 1950s and 1960s were decades of promise, protest, and seismic change in America. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, challenging segregation, discrimination, and centuries of institutionalized racism. But every advance toward equality provoked a reaction, a backlash that often came cloaked in white robes and burning crosses. The Ku Klux Klan, nearly dormant after the collapse of their second national incarnation, re-emerged with renewed ferocity. The Ku Klux Klan re-emerged with renewed ferocity in the 1950s and 1960s, as the Supreme Court's 1954 decision in Brown v. Board of Education mandated desegregation. This was a Klan desperate to reclaim power. They were no longer just a fraternal organization or political movement. They were a terrorist network, willing to murder to maintain racial hierarchy. Their targets were broad: civil rights leaders, activists, African American communities, and anyone who dared to challenge segregation. Freedom riders, school children integrating public schools, and even ordinary black families were hunted by hooded marauders who saw themselves as defenders of an old, fading order. Activists organized marches, sit-ins, voter registration drives. The Klan's tactics had evolved. Bombings became common, particularly against black churches and community centers, the very spaces where activists organized and planned their campaigns. Murders were public, designed to terrorize whole communities. One of the most infamous cases was the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 young African American girls were killed. The horror shocked the nation and became a symbol of the Klan's relentless brutality. A new wave of Klan groups sprang up across the South. These groups were smaller, more fragmented, more secretive. The Klan was emboldened by both local authorities and the tacit approval of many white citizens. In some towns, law enforcement officials were themselves Klansmen, or at minimum, sympathetic to their cause. This infiltration made resistance even more dangerous. Activists often faced the dual threat of violent mobs and institutional indifference, or outright hostility. The Klan thrived in this environment of fear and complicity, but they were no less deadly. Yet the civil rights movement was not passive. Courageous individuals and organizations confronted the Klan's terror head-on. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and Fannie Lou Hamer organized marches, sit-ins, and voter registration drives, knowing full well the risks. Local communities developed networks to protect themselves and document Klan activity. Journalists reported on violence, often putting themselves in danger to expose the truth to the world. These acts of defiance, though small in isolation, collectively chipped away at the Klan's power. Their singular goal was to maintain segregation and uphold white supremacy. Federal intervention became critical. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, reluctantly began infiltrating Klan networks, using informants and undercover agents to gather evidence. Landmark prosecutions, though delayed and often incomplete, eventually held some perpetrators accountable. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 also limited the Klan's ability to intimidate voters and obstruct justice. Through a campaign of terror aimed at civil rights workers, black community leaders, and anyone who dared to challenge Jim Crow, the Klan's response to these setbacks was predictable: escalation. They adapted their methods to evade detection, splintering into smaller, more radical factions. These groups became increasingly violent, targeting civil rights activists with drive-by shootings, beatings, and coordinated attacks. Their desperation was palpable. They were fighting to preserve a social order that the majority of the nation was beginning to reject. The 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killed 4 young girls: Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair. Despite the terror, the civil rights movement persisted. Each act of resistance, each march, each legal victory, struck at the heart of the Klan's authority. Their image as omnipotent enforcers of racial hierarchy was steadily dismantled. International attention, especially coverage on television and in newspapers, highlighted the stark contrast between American ideals of freedom and the reality of racially motivated violence at home. The attack horrified the nation and the world, galvanizing support for the civil rights cause. This era cemented the Klan's reputation as both a symbol of domestic terrorism and a relic of a bygone, violent order. The images of hoods, torches, and burning crosses became globally recognizable, horrific emblems of hate in a world striving for human rights. And yet, while their power diminished in the face of organized resistance and legal enforcement, the ideology underpinning the Klan, white supremacy, racial fear, and hatred, remained, seeding the growth of future extremist groups. In 1964, in Neshoba County, Mississippi, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were murdered by Klansmen. The civil rights era was both a peak and a turning point for the Klan. They were at once highly visible, violent, and feared, but also increasingly exposed, infiltrated, and prosecuted. Their myth of invincibility had been shattered, revealing the limits of terror in the face of courage, justice, and collective action. Their violence backfired, helping to spur the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. By understanding the Klan during this period, we gain insight into the broader struggle for civil rights in America, the courage required to challenge systemic hate, the risks of confronting organized terror, and the resilience of communities determined to secure freedom. The story of the Klan in the 1950s and 1960s is a story of darkness confronted by light, a stark illustration of how terror can provoke resistance rather than compliance. The FBI intensified efforts to infiltrate and disrupt Klan groups. Criminal prosecutions grew, though often hampered by local juries. A crucial shift came with civil litigation. The Southern Poverty Law Center's case for Beulah Mae Donald after her son Michael was lynched. In 1987, an all-white jury bankrupted the United Klans of America, a landmark blow that pioneered using civil suits to dismantle organized hate. The Ku Klux Klan of today is a pale and fractured shadow of its former self. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Ku Klux Klan faced a reality that earlier generations could never have imagined. The nation had begun to fight back effectively. The civil rights victories of the 1960s, combined with persistent legal pressure and investigative journalism, shattered the illusion of the Klan as an unstoppable force. The once feared invisible empire was fragmenting, weakened by lawsuits, internal rivalries, and exposure to the public eye. A few dozen small, competing factions, often with fewer than 100 members each. One of the Klan's greatest vulnerabilities was its reliance on secrecy. For decades, their power had depended on fear of the unknown. But as more journalists, civil rights attorneys, and law enforcement agencies investigated the Klan, their clandestine operations were revealed. The exposure of membership lists, internal communications, and criminal activities stripped away the aura of invincibility. Communities that had once been cowed by rumor and intimidation began to see the Klan for what it was, a violent, disorganized group of extremists, not an omnipotent force. Total membership is only a few thousand nationwide. Legal action became a decisive weapon. Civil suits brought against the Klan for violence, intimidation, and murder began to drain their resources and destabilize leadership. One landmark case, the United Klans of America lawsuit, filed in the 1980s by the Southern Poverty Law Center on behalf of the victims of the lynching of Michael Donald in Alabama, resulted in a $7 million judgment that bankrupted the organization. For the first time in their history, the Klan's activities had severe financial consequences, demonstrating that hate could be prosecuted and punished in court. They have migrated online. Websites, social media, forums, encrypted apps to recruit and spread propaganda. Internal divisions further eroded the Klan's strength. Different factions, each claiming to represent the true Klan, splintered into competing groups. Infighting over leadership, ideology, and strategy became commonplace. These factions often operated independently, undermining the cohesion and national influence that had characterized earlier eras. What had once been a terrifying, coordinated presence became a patchwork of small, disconnected cells. Today's Klan blurs into a wider ecosystem of hate, anti-black racism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant sentiment, Islamophobia. At the same time, public perception shifted. Television, newspapers, and scholarly research exposed the Klan's brutality, hypocrisy, and criminality to a wider audience. Communities increasingly rejected Klan influence, with local governments, civic organizations, and churches refusing to tolerate their presence. Cross burnings and rallies were met with counter-protests, legal injunctions, and community condemnation. The Klan, once capable of dominating the social and political landscape, found itself increasingly isolated and marginalized. Public appearances are rare and often draw more counter-protesters than supporters. Yet even in decline, the Klan demonstrated resilience. While national organizations weakened, local chapters persisted, often adopting new strategies. They infiltrated small towns, maintained low-profile recruitment, and leveraged racial and social anxieties to stay relevant. These remnants were smaller and less coordinated but no less dangerous, illustrating that dismantling a movement rooted in hate requires more than legal victories. It demands vigilance, social change, and cultural awareness. When they rally, they face overwhelming community opposition and heavy police presence. The decline of the Klan also set a precedent for how extremist groups could be confronted in America. Lawsuits, federal investigations, and public exposure became effective tools against organized hate, providing a blueprint for confronting later extremist movements, from neo-Nazi organizations to modern white supremacist networks. Lone actor violence remains a threat, but systemic terror campaigns like before are beyond their capacity. By the end of this era, the Klan had been stripped of its national power. Its mythology of omnipresence was shattered, its leadership fractured, and its activities increasingly scrutinized. The invisible empire was no longer invisible. It had been revealed, challenged, and diminished. The history of the Klan is ultimately a story about people, victims whose lives were cut short, survivors who carried scars, communities shaped by fear. However, the ideas that fueled the Klan did not vanish. White supremacy, racial fear, and extremist ideology continued to persist in American society, often re-emerging in new forms and under different names. The decline of the old Klan did not mark the end of racial terror. It marked a transformation, a lesson in adaptation that would inform the resurgence of hate groups in the decades to follow. We must remember the 4 little girls, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and thousands more whose names are lost. The fragmentation and decline of the Klan teach us an essential lesson. Even the most entrenched organizations of hate are vulnerable when confronted with legal pressure, public scrutiny, and societal change. But the persistence of their ideology warns that dismantling hate requires continuous vigilance, education, and resistance. Terror silenced votes, blocked schooling, drove families from homes, and created generational trauma. The 1970s ushered in an era of transformation for extremist movements in the United States. The old Ku Klux Klan, once a sprawling national organization, had been fractured by legal action, internal rivalries, and societal resistance. Yet while the robes and rituals of the traditional Klan faded from public streets, the ideology that had fueled it, white supremacy, racial fear, and xenophobia, never disappeared. Instead, it mutated, giving rise to new organizations, networks, and movements determined to continue the Klan's mission under different guises. Yet there was resilience. Ida B. Wells and countless activists exposed lynching, marched, protested, and registered voters. During this period, small Klan factions persisted in isolated pockets across the South. These groups, while lacking the scale and visibility of their predecessors, continued to promote racial terror, intimidation, and segregationist propaganda. Membership dwindled, and leadership was often contested, but the symbolism of the Klan, the robes, the hoods, the burning cross, remained a potent psychological weapon. For many, the Klan had become less a cohesive organization and more a brand, a recognizable emblem of fear and hatred that inspired copycat groups and lone extremists. Families preserved their stories, keeping truth alive. The 1980s and 1990s saw the rise of broader white supremacist networks, many of which borrowed strategies from the Klan's historical playbook. Neo-Nazi organizations, skinhead gangs, and militia movements adapted the Klan's tactics, blending violence, propaganda, and public demonstration to amplify their reach. In many ways, the Klan became a mentor from the past, a template for organized hate. Though these new groups often rejected the Klan's traditional Southern identity, they shared the core principles of racial superiority and intolerance. Remembrance, education, and honest teaching are our strongest defenses against the resurgence of hate. Media and technology also changed the landscape. While earlier Klans relied on local parades, rallies, and newspapers to spread their message, modern groups leveraged television coverage, VHS tapes, and eventually the internet to disseminate ideology. The psychological strategies pioneered by the Klan, the use of symbols, spectacle, and fear, remained central to these new movements. They discovered that visibility could be both a recruitment tool and a method of intimidation, echoing the lessons of the 1920s Klan. By learning from this painful history, we honor those who suffered and take up their struggle to forge a future free from the shadow of hate. Legal and societal pressure continued to weaken the Klan's influence. Federal investigations, civil lawsuits, and hate crime prosecutions targeted members of active Klan chapters and their offshoots. Organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center tracked extremist networks, exposing their activities and connecting violence to ideology. Yet despite these measures, isolated acts of Klan-inspired terror persisted, reminding the nation that the ghosts of the invisible empire were never fully exorcised. Lesson learnt from the shadows. The Ku Klux Klan is more than a chapter in American history. It is a lens through which we can examine the recurring patterns of hate, fear, and power in society. For over 150 years, the Klan has demonstrated that ideology, terror, and symbolism can combine to create a force that both terrifies and captivates. Their story is a warning, a chronicle of how ordinary people, motivated by fear, prejudice, or ambition, can unite to commit extraordinary acts of cruelty. From its inception in the Reconstruction-era South to its revival in the 1920s, the Klan has exploited moments of social upheaval. Its strategies, violence, intimidation, propaganda, and spectacle, evolved with each era, yet its central aim remained unchanged: the preservation of a racial hierarchy built on white supremacy. The Klan's ability to adapt, infiltrate institutions, and manipulate public perception ensured its persistence, even when national attention or federal enforcement threatened to dismantle it. Yet the history of the Klan is also a history of resistance, from the freedmen who fought back during Reconstruction to civil rights activists marching in Selma and Birmingham. Courageous individuals consistently challenged the Klan's authority. Legal action, federal intervention, and investigative journalism exposed atrocities, holding perpetrators accountable and diminishing the group's power. These stories remind us that terror, no matter how meticulously organized, is not invincible. Courage, collective action, and moral clarity can confront even the most entrenched forces of hate. The Klan's legacy persists in unsettling ways. While the national organization has largely disappeared, its ideology endures, finding new life in contemporary extremist movements. Neo-Nazis, white supremacist militias, and online radical networks echo the same principles that guided the Klan a century ago: fear of change, hatred of the other, and a desire to assert dominance through both ideology and violence. The tools may have evolved, but the pattern remains. When society experiences rapid change or perceived threats, extremist movements exploit fear to gain influence. This history offers lessons for today. Combating hate requires more than confronting violent acts. It requires addressing the beliefs, fears, and systemic inequalities that allow extremist ideologies to take root. Education, cultural awareness, legal accountability, and community resilience are essential to preventing the re-emergence of movements like the Klan. Vigilance is not optional, it is a moral imperative. Moreover, the story of the Klan challenges the comforting notion that extremism is a thing of the past. It reminds us that terror can take many forms: symbolic, ideological, and physical. By studying the Klan's history, society gains insight into the psychological mechanisms of fear, the social dynamics of prejudice, and the consequences of complacency. Ultimately, the Ku Klux Klan's 150-year history is a mirror, reflecting both the darkest impulses and the resilient courage of America. It reveals how easily fear and prejudice can be weaponized, but also how courage, law, and community solidarity can dismantle even the most intimidating structures of hate. The story of the Klan is a story of darkness and light, of terror and resistance, and of a nation struggling to reconcile its ideals with its realities. As we look to the future, the lessons are clear. The fight against hate is ongoing, the vigilance must be constant, and the memory of the past must inform every effort to build a more just, equitable society. The invisible empire may no longer march openly through the streets, but its legacy endures as a warning. Hatred left unchecked can fester, adapt, and return in new, unpredictable forms. Confronting this legacy is not merely an act of remembrance, it is an act of moral responsibility. By understanding the rise, persistence, and consequences of the Klan, society can recognize the warning signs of extremism, resist the allure of fear and prejudice, and commit to a future where terror and hatred no longer hold sway. The story of the Ku Klux Klan is not just a chronicle of the past, it is a call to action for the present and the future. Facing the shadows of history. As the hooded figures of the Ku Klux Klan recede into history, their legacy lingers, casting long shadows over the American landscape. More than 150 years of racism, terror, and organized hate have left indelible marks on communities, families, and the national consciousness. Yet the Klan's story is not only a record of cruelty, it is also a testament to resilience, resistance, and the enduring struggle for justice. The Klan's rise, fall, and persistence reveal patterns that resonate far beyond their own organization. They show how fear can be weaponized, how social anxieties can be manipulated, and how violence can be cloaked in the guise of morality, patriotism, or religious righteousness. Across generations, the Klan demonstrated that terror need not be constant to be effective. The threat of violence, amplified by secrecy and spectacle, can shape behavior, silence dissent, and assert control. Yet the history of the Klan also illuminates the power of courage. From Reconstruction to the Civil Rights era, ordinary people risked their lives to confront extraordinary evil. African Americans, allies, journalists, activists, and even some government officials refused to be intimidated. They documented atrocities, marched in defiance, and fought tirelessly in courts and communities to dismantle a network built on fear. Their bravery underscores a central truth. Hate thrives only where it is allowed to go unchallenged. Resistance, collective action, and moral courage are essential counterweights to terror. The modern echoes of the Klan remind us that ideology is resilient. Extremist beliefs, prejudice, and white supremacist ideas persist in different forms, from online radical networks to fringe political movements. The Klan's decline in numbers does not erase its historical impact, nor does it guarantee that society is immune from similar movements in the future. The Ku Klux Klan story is intertwined with the broader American narrative. It is a tale of a nation grappling with freedom, equality, and identity. It is a story of how fear can divide, how ideology can justify atrocity, and how courage can reclaim justice. And above all, it is a story of the human capacity for both destruction and resilience. As we reflect on 150 years of the Klan, we confront an uncomfortable truth. The legacy of hate is never confined to the past. It exists wherever fear, prejudice, and inequality persist. But we also see hope in the enduring resistance to oppression, the victories of civil rights activists, and the legal, social, and moral frameworks that continue to challenge extremism. The Ku Klux Klan, once a terrifying force that seemed omnipresent in the shadows of American society, is now a cautionary tale. Its robes may still appear in sporadic rallies, and its ideology may linger in extremist networks, but its history offers society an invaluable guide to confront hate, to educate, to resist, and to never forget. Kindly subscribe for more videos on this channel. What do you think of this documentary in the comments section?